Imagine, for just a moment, a detective, let's go ahead and call him Medlock Holmes, stepping into this vast, sprawling hall of mirrors.
Ooh, I like that.
Right. And each mirror in this hall reflects a completely different aspect of human experience. You look into one and it reflects mood. Another reflects thought or, perception, memory, behavior, identity, motivation, consciousness.
The whole spectrum, really.
Exactly. And for most people just sort of walking through this hall, the reflections remain relatively coherent. They integrate into a recognizable whole. Yet, in some of these mirrors, subtle distortions begin to appear. A thought becomes fixed, unable to move. An emotion becomes so overwhelmingly large, it shatters the glass.
That's a very vivid image.
Yeah, or a perception no longer matches the physical reality of the room. A behavior completely loses its adaptive purpose.
That is a phenomenal way to conceptualize the daily reality of a psychiatrist, because Holmes would quickly realize that, unlike a fractured femur or, say, a blocked artery, psychiatric disorders rarely announce themselves through definitive laboratory tests or imaging findings.
Right, you can't just order a blood test for a shattered mirror.
Exactly. Instead, they reveal themselves through clinical manifestations, those observable and reported distortions in the mirrors, as you put it.
And that is really where the immense challenge lies, isn't it? Because usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of mechanical precision, like an orthopedic surgeon looking at an X-ray, pointing to a jagged white line and saying, there it is, broken.
Spot on, yeah.
But when you step into the world of psychiatric classification, that X-ray machine simply doesn't exist. We're no longer looking at a clear break on a screen. If we shift the metaphor a bit, it's as if we are mapping a vast, constantly shifting continent representing human distress.
And we're trying to figure out where the borders are.
Exactly. And for decades, the map makers of the world have been arguing over exactly where to draw those borders. Do we use rigid GPS coordinates? Highly accurate operational criteria that tell you exactly where you are mathematically, but completely ignore the actual terrain you are standing on.
Which is a very common critique, yes.
Right. Or do we draw topographical maps? Rich, narrative clinical descriptors that help the local guides actually navigate the landscape. So today, we are exploring the release of the newest, most comprehensive map we have, the World Health Organization's ICD-11.
And to actively navigate this new map, we really need a philosophical anchor for this discussion. If we distill our field down to its absolute essence, psychiatry is the study of how brain, mind, and experience interact, and critically, how that incredibly complex process can go wrong.
Right, because it's never just one thing, is it?
No, never. Symptoms rarely occur in isolation. Depression isn't just sadness. It is altered sleep, diminished concentration, profound loss of motivation, physical psychomotor changes.
It's a whole cluster.
Exactly. Individual symptoms cluster into syndromes. Syndromes become diagnoses. And those diagnoses become the frameworks we use to understand and ultimately treat the human being sitting opposite us.
Which brings us to the actual mission of our deep dive today. We are not just going to memorize a new list of diagnostic codes so you can survive your next clinic shift.
That would be incredibly dry.
Yeah, no one wants that.
Yeah.
If you are a psychiatry trainee, a registrar, or a seasoned clinician joining us, we are undertaking a conceptual synthesis of Chapter 9.2 of Kaplan and Sadok's comprehensive textbook of psychiatry.
Like a heavy hitter.
The Bible, really. We are exploring the hidden architecture of psychiatric diagnosis. We're examining the fundamental ways the ICD-11 differs from the DSM-5 and uncovering the underlying mechanisms of how psychiatrists actually think when they transform complex, messy human suffering into recognizable, actionable patterns.
It is a massive intellectual undertaking, honestly. But before we even look at how the new borders are drawn in the ICD-11, we must ask a rather controversial epistemological question. What is a classification system actually for?
That is the big question.
Because how you answer that question well, it dictates the entire architecture of the system you build.
I found myself grappling with this a lot while reading the chapter. To make sense of it, I kept coming back to an analogy of operating systems.
Okay, let's hear it.
So the DSM and the ICD feel a bit like the Apple versus Android of psychiatric classification. The DSM, the American system, is like Apple. It is a closed, strictly regulated, highly polished ecosystem.
Yes, very rigid.
Right. It's built primarily for North American practitioners and researchers, and it tells you exactly, rigidly, how you must use it. The ICD, on the other hand, is Android. It is an open-source global platform.
That's a brilliant way to phrase it.
Yeah. It has to function on thousands of different devices, meaning wildly different health systems worldwide. from a highly resourced research hospital in London to a rural primary care clinic in sub-Saharan Africa. Does that conceptualization hold water clinically, do you think?
It holds water beautifully, actually. The textbook explicitly states a rather humbling admission for a medical manual, which is that classifications are not true or false, but only useful or not useful depending on their purpose.
Wow. Not true or false. That's a big admission.
It really is. We are not carving nature at its joints. We are constructing tools. The DSM, developed by the American Psychiatric Association, takes a prescriptive, top-down approach.
So it's dictating from above.
Exactly. It relies heavily on highly operationalized criteria, strict symptom counts, exact duration cutoffs. The goal there is high reliability, which is absolutely paramount for research. If an epidemiologist is running a multi-center clinical trial, the DSM is the gold standard because it ensures a homogeneous sample.
So the researcher needs absolute certainty that the depressed patient recruited in New York is virtually identical on paper to the depressed patient recruited in California. Otherwise, the drug trial data is compromised.
Exactly. You need that homogeneity. But the ICD, managed by the World Health Organization, takes a bottom-up approach. Its paramount goal is global clinical utility.
It has to actually work in the real world.
Yes. It is an official world classification, provided free of charge, multilingual, and multicultural. And to truly grasp the scale of the ICD, you have to understand that it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It is merely one component of a massive architectural framework called the WHO FIC.
Right, the WHO Family of International Classifications. The textbook breaks the WHO FIC down into 3 distinct tiers, and honestly, the acronyms come thick and fast here.
They really do.
We have the reference classifications, the derived classifications, and the related classifications. Could we unpack those with a bit of clinical context so we aren't just swimming in alphabet soup?
Of course. Think of the reference classifications as the foundational pillars of global health data. This includes the core ICD itself, which covers everything from cholera to traumatic brain injuries.
So the physical stuff, too.
Everything. But it also includes the ICF, the International Classification of Functioning, Disability, and Health. Let's use a physical example to illustrate why the ICF is so vital. Imagine 2 patients who both suffer a traumatic amputation of their left hand.
Okay.
The ICD code for the injury itself is identical for both. But what if one patient is a concert pianist and the other is a retired teacher?
Oh, wow. Yeah, the impact is completely different.
Exactly. The functional impairment, the actual disability experienced in their daily lives, is vastly different. The ICF captures that nuance. It separates the biological event from the lived disability.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
So where does mental health fit into this hierarchy then?
That brings us to the derived classifications. These are specialized systems built by extracting and rearranging elements from the reference classifications for a specific specialty.
Oh.
So the ICD-11 for mental, behavioral, or neurodevelopmental disorders, the specific mental health map we are discussing today, is a derived classification.
Got it.
Finally, you have the related classifications, which cover other specific aspects of healthcare delivery, such as the ICPC-2, the International Classification of Primary Care. That one is tailored for general practitioners who need to code reasons for a patient encounter rather than a final specialist diagnosis.
So synthesizing this back to the clinician sitting in the room with a patient, if the DSM is perfectly engineered for the epidemiologist, it might actually be a hindrance for the clinician on the ground.
In many ways, yes.
Like a highly rigid operationalized system might force a registrar to say, well, looking at this checklist, you only have 4 out of the 9 required symptoms. You need 5. Therefore, you don't have a major depressive episode. Even when their clinical intuition and the patient's profound distress scream that an intervention is necessary.
Which happens all the time in practice.
Right. So the ICD seems to prioritize the clinician's ability to actually use the map in real time over the researcher's need for statistical purity.
That is the core tension in modern psychiatry, really. The transition from the ICD-10 to the ICD-11 was a monumental attempt to resolve that tension in favor of global clinical utility. It was an incredibly delayed, complex, and highly consultative process led by the WHO's Topic Advisory Group and the Global Clinical Practice Network.
It took years, didn't it?
Years and years. They didn't just lock a small committee of Western academics in a room in Geneva to write the rules. They established vast internet-based field trials allowing thousands of mental health and primary care professionals across the globe to participate directly in testing the diagnostic guidelines.
And crucially, they tested these guidelines in multiple languages simultaneously: Chinese, English, French, Japanese, Russian, and Spanish. They weren't just translating words. They were testing whether the clinical concepts themselves held up across linguistic and cultural boundaries.
Which is unprecedented, and the tangible result of this global effort is the Clinical Descriptions and Diagnostic Guidelines, or the CDDG. This is where the mechanics of making a diagnosis fundamentally diverge from the DSM-5. As you noted, the DSM relies on strict symptoms, counting 5 out of 9 symptoms for 2 weeks.
Classic checklist.
Right. But the ICD-11 relies on a cognitive strategy called prototype matching.
This was one of the most fascinating mechanisms in the chapter. How does prototype matching actually play out in a busy psychiatric clinic?
Well, prototype matching is actually a brilliant reflection of how human cognition operates naturally. Consider how you recognize a friend's face in a crowded room. You don't freeze, pull out a ruler, measure the distance between their pupils, check the angle of their jaw, and tick boxes off a criteria list.
That would be terrifying.
Right. You take in the entire image at once, the gestalt, and you match it against a holistic prototype stored in your memory. The ICD-11 harnesses this exact natural cognitive strategy.
So how does that look on paper?
Instead of a rigid checklist, the clinician is provided with a rich narrative description of the disorder's essential features, the core presentation you would reasonably expect to find in all cases. The clinician reads this paragraph, evaluates the patient sitting in front of them, and uses their expert clinical judgment to rate how well the patient matches the prototype on a scale of 1 to 5.
So the 1 would indicate like little or no match, essentially ruling it out, and a 5 would be a very good match, the classic textbook presentation.
Precisely. Ratings of 4 and 5 correspond to the definite presence of the disorder. A rating of 3 is particularly useful. It indicates a subthreshold presentation.
Meaning they're close, but not quite there.
Yes. It tells the clinician, this patient has clinically significant features that warrant our attention and perhaps intervention, even if they don't meet the full threshold for a categorical diagnosis. It's a dimensional approach that respects the grayscale of human suffering, but it still ultimately yields a categorical code that administrators and health systems require for resource allocation.
I appreciate the elegance of that. It places a massive amount of trust in the clinician's training and observational skills. But I have to play devil's advocate here.
Please do.
If we are relying on a narrative prototype and the subjective judgment of the clinician, how on earth do you standardize a diagnosis globally? Because culture completely alters the manifestation of symptoms. If a prototype is inherently written from a Western psychiatric perspective, won't it fundamentally misinterpret non-Western expressions of distress?
That is a brilliant critique, and it was perhaps the most significant hurdle the ICD-11 developers faced. To mitigate that exact risk, they did something unprecedented. They embedded cultural nuances directly into the diagnostic guidelines.
Right in the text.
Yes. Every single diagnostic area in the ICD-11 now includes a dedicated section on culture-related features. The textbook provides a stunning illustration of this using panic disorder.
Oh, the panic attack examples. Those really bring this to life. A panic attack looks completely different depending on the cultural lens of the patient experiencing it.
Indeed. In Western psychiatric training, we are taught that a panic attack typically involves palpitations, shortness of breath, a fear of imminent death, or a fear of losing one's mind.
The classic presentation.
Right. But let's apply this to a patient of Cambodian origin. They might arrive at the clinic presenting with profound dizziness, tinnitus, and severe neck soreness. Within traditional Cambodian ethnophysiology, this constellation of somatic symptoms is attributed to the dysregulation of chyle, which is conceptualized as a wind-like substance flowing through the body. Or take a Latin American patient who might present with an attaque de nervios, an episode characterized by intense emotional upset, uncontrollable trembling, shouting, and sometimes aggressive outbursts, usually triggered by an acute interpersonal conflict.
Very different from shortness of breath.
Exactly. Or a Vietnamese patient experiencing Trung Gio, where acute anxiety and physical malaise are directly attributed to exposure to an atmospheric cold wind.
So as a clinician, if a Cambodian patient sits down, complains of severe neck soreness and dizziness, and explains that it's because the wind in their body is dysregulated, the worst thing you could do is dismiss their cultural framework and say, no, you're wrong, that's just a panic attack.
That would be clinical malpractice, quite frankly. The clinician's job isn't to correct the patient's cultural beliefs. It is to understand how those beliefs interact with the diagnostic criteria. Here's the crux of the clinical reasoning. The absolute core requirement for panic disorder is that the panic attacks must be unexpected.
They have to come out of nowhere.
They must come out of the blue. If a Vietnamese patient is exposed to a cold wind, and their entire cultural framework has conditioned them to believe that transient illness and acute anxiety will inevitably follow, then the subsequent anxiety they feel is actually expected within their reality.
Oh, I see.
Therefore, it might not constitute a true, unexpected panic episode indicative of panic disorder. The cultural context doesn't just color the psychopathology, it fundamentally defines it. You cannot separate the mind from the cultural soil in which it grew.
That is a profound shift in clinical reasoning. It really moves us away from a culturally blind checklist toward a deeply contextualized understanding of distress.
Absolutely.
So we've established the overarching philosophy clinical utility, and we've explored the mechanisms of prototype matching and cultural integration. Let's look at how this new topographical map applies to the actual clinical manifestations. Let's start with the heaviest hitters in psychiatry, schizophrenia and primary psychotic disorders. The map has been radically redrawn here.
The changes to schizophrenia in the ICD-11 represent the dismantling of decades of historical dogma. For nearly a century, European and global psychiatry relied heavily on Kurt Schneider's first-rank symptoms.
These are the big ones we all learned in med school.
Yes, these included specific experiences like thought broadcasting, hearing voices arguing about you in the third person, or delusions of being controlled by an outside force. For a long time, these were considered highly specific, almost pathognomonic, for schizophrenia. If you saw them, you made the diagnosis.
But the ICD-11 has formally de-emphasized them.
It has.
Because the longitudinal research finally caught up and showed they aren't as exclusive to schizophrenia as we thought.
Exactly. Large-scale epidemiological studies demonstrated that you can see these exact same first-rank symptoms in severe psychotic depression, in bipolar mania, and in certain substance-induced psychoses. They are severe psychotic symptoms, yes, but they do not belong exclusively to schizophrenia. So the ICD-11 recalibrated the criteria. Now, a diagnosis requires the presence of 2 out of 8 possible symptoms for at least 1 month. And crucially, at least one of those must be a core symptom.
Like delusions or hallucinations.
Right. Delusions, hallucinations, thought insertion or withdrawal, or disorganized thinking.
And just as important as what they tweaked in the symptoms is what they completely deleted. The traditional clinical subtypes are gone. I remember learning about paranoid schizophrenia, catatonic schizophrenia, disorganized schizophrenia. Both the ICD-11 and the DSM-5 wipe these out entirely.
And for very good reason. The subtypes created an illusion of precision that simply didn't exist in reality because they lacked longitudinal stability. Let's trace a patient's journey. A 22-year-old might experience their first psychotic break and present with overwhelming paranoid delusions and auditory hallucinations. Under the old system, they are labeled with paranoid schizophrenia.
Right.
But psychiatric illnesses are dynamic. Fast forward 10 years. That same patient, now 32, might no longer experience active paranoia, but their clinical picture is now entirely dominated by negative symptoms: profound apathy, alogia or poverty of speech, and social withdrawal.
So the label is outdated.
The paranoid label is now not only inaccurate, it's actively misleading for any new clinician taking over their care. The subtypes were static labels applied to a fluid illness.
So if we strip away those familiar subtype labels, how does a clinician rapidly communicate what is actually happening to the patient right now? This is where the ICD-11 introduces the concept of qualifiers, which function somewhat like the specifiers in the DSM. Instead of forcing the patient into a rigid subtype box, the ICD-11 gives the clinician a mixing board.
I love the mixing board analogy.
Yeah, so you have symptom qualifiers. You can note if the patient is currently experiencing positive symptoms, negative symptoms, depressive symptoms, or psychomotor agitation. You have course qualifiers. Is this their first episode? Are there multiple episodes? Are they in full remission or partial remission? And you have cognitive qualifiers to track cognitive decline.
It perfectly captures the flexibility of the system. It allows the clinician to create a high-fidelity, highly accurate snapshot of the patient's precise state at the exact moment of the assessment. And there is a monumental conceptual difference between the ICD-11 and the DSM-5 regarding how they view functional impairment in schizophrenia.
Right, this is huge.
In the DSM-5, functional impairment is a mandatory diagnostic criterion. This means that if a patient experiences persistent hallucinations and delusions, but they somehow manage to develop coping mechanisms, maintain their relationships, and hold down a demanding job, the DSM-5 criteria hesitate to classify them as having schizophrenia because they aren't functionally impaired enough.
So the DSM binds the disease directly to the disability. The ICD-11 takes a completely different philosophical stance, doesn't it? It tracks functional impairment using that mixing board of qualifiers, but it is explicitly not required to make the core diagnosis.
This is a vital alignment with the ICF we discussed earlier. The ICD maintains a strict, unyielding conceptual separation between the definition of a disease and the consequences of that disease. The disease in this context is the underlying neurobiological and psychological dysfunction generating the psychotic symptoms. The disability, the functional impairment, is a separate phenomenon resulting from how that disease interacts with the person's specific environment, social support, and resilience.
Which means a patient could be a highly successful architect who experiences chronic auditory hallucinations. Under the ICD-11, their success doesn't erase their diagnosis.
Exactly. By shifting impairment to a qualifier rather than a core criterion, it moves psychiatry away from a purely deficit-focused model. It acknowledges that recovery and high functioning are possible even with severe mental illness. It's a profoundly humanizing shift toward recovery-based rehabilitation.
Let's pivot from psychosis to mood disorders. Because if we thought the debates around schizophrenia were intense, the arguments during the ICD-11 development regarding mood and anxiety were apparently fierce. Let's look at a diagnostic category that the DSM outright rejected, but the ICD embraced: mixed anxiety and depressive disorder.
This debate perfectly encapsulates the tension between the top-down researcher and the bottom-up clinician. If you speak to general practitioners or primary care clinicians anywhere in the world, they will tell you that a massive proportion of their patients do not neatly fit into our pristine psychiatric boxes.
Right, people are messy.
A patient will present with a perfect 50-50 split of anxiety and depression. They are chronically worried, tense, but also profoundly sad, lethargic, and hopeless. However, when you tally up their symptoms, they fall just short of the strict threshold for major depressive disorder, and they don't quite meet the duration criteria for generalized anxiety disorder.
Yet their distress is profound and their impairment is real.
Exactly.
And under the DSM's rigid architecture, what happens to that patient? They get tossed into a vague bucket labeled unspecified anxiety disorder or unspecified depressive disorder,
Which offers zero clinical utility. The DSM committee rejected the mixed category, arguing that it lacked clean boundaries and biological validity for research purposes. But the ICD developers, listening to the demands of the Global Clinical Practice Network, retained mixed anxiety and depressive disorder.
They listen to the doctors on the ground.
They did. They recognized that primary care doctors need a valid conceptual framework and a specific diagnostic home for these incredibly common presentations, allowing them to initiate appropriate broad-spectrum treatment rather than waiting for the patient to get worse just to fit a cleaner criteria set.
But arguably the most intense epistemological clash. A fight over the very definition of what constitutes a mental illness centered around the bereavement exclusion.
Ah, yes. The controversy over human grief. For a very long time, diagnostic systems operated under a compassionate rule. If a patient presents with all the classic symptoms of a major depressive episode, deep, intractable sadness, insomnia, severe loss of appetite, and inability to concentrate, but they recently lost a loved one, say a spouse or a child, the clinician stays their hand.
You don't label it depression.
No, you do not diagnose them with major depressive disorder. You conceptualize it as normal bereavement. But in a highly controversial move, the DSM-5 eliminated this exclusion.
Wait, really? Why?
The rationale was that severe grief can act as a trigger for a true neurobiological depressive episode, and we shouldn't withhold clinical treatment just because we happen to know the psychological trigger.
But the ICD-11 developers pushed back against that logic vehemently.
They did, and the textbook leans heavily on the sociological and evolutionary arguments presented by scholars like Alan Horowitz and Jerome Wakefield, specifically referencing their influential book, The Loss of Sadness. The core argument is that profound sadness, even impairing sadness that disrupts sleep and appetite, is a biologically evolved, deeply normal human response to catastrophic loss.
Why? It's supposed to hurt.
It is a feature of the human condition, not a bug. By removing the bereavement exclusion, the ICD developers feared that psychiatry was engaging in the pathologizing of normal human processes.
It's the risk of medicalizing the human soul, isn't it? If a mother loses her child, and 2 weeks later she can't sleep, she isn't eating, and she can't focus on work, the DSM-5 suggests she might have a psychiatric disorder. The ICD-11 draws a hard line and says, no, her brain is doing exactly what it evolved to do in the face of unimaginable tragedy. That isn't a disorder. That is being human.
It is a profound philosophical statement about the boundaries of our profession. It asks us to respect the immense weight of human context.
Which brings us beautifully to how the ICD-11 handles trauma and personality. Because if context matters in grief, it is the absolute foundation of trauma. The ICD-11 draws some incredibly specific lines here that separate normal fear from pathology.
In the realm of stress and trauma, the ICD-11 is meticulous about defining what is adaptive versus what is disordered. One of the most critical clarifications is the handling of acute stress reaction.
How so?
In previous diagnostic iterations, if someone experienced extreme acute distress immediately following a horrific event, it was often codified as a mental disorder. The ICD-11 formally reclassifies an acute stress reaction as a normal reaction to an abnormal event.
This is, again, depathologizing survival.
Exactly. If you are surviving a natural disaster or trapped in a war zone, experiencing extreme fear, hyperarousal, and even transient dissociation are hardwired survival mechanisms designed to keep you alive. They are not symptoms of a broken mind. They are evidence of a functioning survival system.
But when that survival system fails to switch off, we enter the territory of disorder. The ICD-11 splits this into PTSD and a massive new addition, complex PTSD. What is the clinical logic behind separating the two?
Standard PTSD is characterized by a specific core triad of symptoms. You have re-experiencing the trauma in the present moment, like flashbacks. You have active avoidance of internal or external reminders of the event. And you have a persistent sense of current threat, manifested as hyperarousal or exaggerated startle response.
Okay, that's standard PTSD.
Right. Complex PTSD, or CPTSD, incorporates that entire core triad but adds something fundamentally deeper: profound, pervasive disturbances in self-organization.
How does that actually manifest in the patient?
CPTSD typically arises not from a single discrete traumatic event like a car crash, but from prolonged repetitive trauma from which escape was physically or psychologically impossible. Think chronic childhood abuse, prolonged domestic violence, or captivity.
So it's trauma over years.
Yes. Because the trauma occurs over years, often during developmental windows, it alters the very structure of the patient's personality. They present with severe problems in affect regulation, meaning they cannot soothe their own emotional states. They develop a deeply negative self-concept, truly believing they are permanently damaged, defeated, and worthless. And they experience severe, enduring difficulties in sustaining any form of interpersonal relationship. The diagnosis acknowledges that chronic trauma doesn't just cause anxiety, it shatters the self.
That concept of the shattered self is the perfect segue to what I genuinely believe is the most radical, jaw-dropping shift in the entire ICD-11 manual, the absolute overhaul of personality disorders. When I read this section of the text, I had to read it twice. They completely abolished the names.
It is a sweeping, fundamental paradigm shift that has upended decades of psychiatric practice. Since the inception of modern classification, we have relied on type-specific categorical labels: borderline personality disorder, antisocial, narcissistic, histrionic, dependent. The ICD-11 abolishes every single one of them. The only diagnosis that remains is the general meta-category of personality disorder.
I have to interject here because as a clinician, my immediate reaction is panic.
Understandably.
If we strip away the word borderline, aren't we just stripping away decades of clinical shorthand? If an A&E registrar calls me at 2 a.m. and says, I'm admitting a patient with borderline personality disorder, a massive amount of clinical information is transferred in a single second. I instantly know to prepare for potential self-harm, intense emotional lability, and complex interpersonal dynamics. Doesn't deleting these labels severely slow down clinical communication?
Your reaction is exactly what the field experienced. The loss of that heuristic shorthand feels deeply uncomfortable, but we have to ruthlessly examine why they abolished them. The categorical types were an illusion of specificity that collapsed under clinical reality. The biggest issue was massive comorbidity. Patients rarely, if ever, fit perfectly into just one neat box. A patient might meet the criteria for borderline, histrionic, and narcissistic personality disorder simultaneously.
Or, conversely, they are profoundly impaired. Their life is in shambles due to their interpersonal dysfunction. But because they only have 3 traits of borderline and 3 traits of dependence, they don't meet the threshold for anything, and they get the dreaded, useless label of personality disorder, not otherwise specified.
Exactly. The categorical system forced complex human personalities into rigid artificial silos. The ICD-11 replaces this flawed system with a 2-step dimensional process, a severity scale paired with trait domain qualifiers. The first step forces the clinician to evaluate just how broken the patient's functioning actually is. Is the personality disorder mild, moderate, or severe?
Let's build a clinical picture of those severity levels based on the text.
The severity is judged by the profoundness of the interpersonal dysfunction and the risk of harm. A mild personality disorder might look like a patient who experiences notable recurring problems in many interpersonal relationships. Perhaps they're consistently overly dependent or frequently get into arguments, but they manage to maintain some stable friendships and can hold down employment. A moderate disorder escalates. You see marked problems across almost all social and occupational situations, frequent, intense conflict, and perhaps recurrent self-harm behaviors, though typically without clear lethal intent.
And the severe category. The textbook's definition of this is incredibly stark.
It is. Severe personality disorder equates to profound, pervasive social dysfunction. The ability to perform standard occupational or social roles is either entirely absent or severely compromised. The textbook explicitly states a presentation might involve having no friends or being unwilling or unable to sustain regular work. Crucially, it almost always involves a history and a future expectation of severe harm to self or others.
So active, dangerous risk.
This means suicide attempts with a clear, calculated expectation of death or episodes of interpersonal violence sufficient to cause lasting physical injury.
Okay, so step 1 gives us the severity, the degree of the dysfunction. Step 2 is where we describe the actual flavor of the pathology without using the old labels. We use trait domain qualifiers. There are 5 domains. Let's really dig into how these manifest in a patient interview because this is the new language of psychopathology.
Let's start with negative affectivity. This is the tendency to experience a broad, intense range of distressing emotions. Anxiety, anger, vulnerability, depression, often out of proportion to the situation. A patient with prominent negative affectivity is emotionally raw. Their baseline is a stress.
Got it. What's the second?
Next is dissocial. This replaces much of what we called antisocial or psychopathic. It is characterized by a fundamental disregard for the rights and feelings of others. It manifests as callousness, lack of empathy, manipulation, and a ruthless pursuit of self-interest.
Okay, and the third?
Third is disinhibition. This is the tendency to act impulsively based on immediate internal or external stimuli without considering the consequences. It's recklessness, irresponsibility, and an inability to delay gratification.
The fourth one is anancastic, which is a term we don't hear as often in general parlance. How does an anancastic trait actually present in the room?
Anancastic refers to a rigid, narrow, and unyielding focus on controlling one's own behavior and the behavior of others to ensure things conform to an exact, internalized standard of perfection. In a session, this is the patient who brings a meticulously color-coded, cross-referenced spreadsheet of their symptoms, insists on sitting in the exact same chair at the exact same angle, and becomes visibly distressed or hostile if the session starts 2 minutes late. They are trapped in their own rigidity.
Wow, that paints a very clear picture. And the last one?
Finally, we have detachment. This is the profound tendency to maintain emotional and interpersonal distance. It's not just shyness, it's a fundamental aloofness, a lack of desire for intimacy, and a restricted range of emotional expression.
So bringing it all together, instead of using the shorthand borderline personality disorder, a clinician under the ICD-11 framework might diagnose a moderate personality disorder with prominent negative affectivity and disinhibition. It forces the clinician to actually deconstruct and think about the psychological mechanisms driving the patient's dysfunction, rather than just slapping a label on them and assuming everyone knows what that means.
Exactly. It's intellectually demanding, but clinically brilliant.
Before we move on to how all these systems integrate, we must briefly touch on 2 specific updates in the text regarding addictions and intellectual developmental disorders, as they reflect broader societal shifts.
Yes. In the realm of addictions, the ICD-11 formally introduces gaming disorder. However, we must be incredibly precise here to prevent the medicalization of a common hobby and avoid a moral panic.
Right, because kids play a lot of video games.
Exactly. This diagnosis is not for a teenager who spends their weekend playing video games. The ICD-11 establishes stringent criteria. It requires a pattern of impaired control over gaming, whether online or offline, to the point where gaming takes absolute priority over other life interests and essential daily activities, despite the occurrence of significant negative consequences.
So it's ruining their life.
Yes. And, crucially, to separate a temporary binge from an addiction, this behavior pattern must be consistently manifested for a prolonged period of at least 12 months, causing significant impairment in personal, family, or occupational functioning.
And regarding IDD?
This is a vital conceptual and linguistic shift. The outdated and heavily stigmatized term mental retardation has been officially replaced with intellectual developmental disorders, or IDD. It conceptualizes the condition not merely as a static, lifelong intellectual deficit, but as a dynamic lifespan condition affecting core cognitive functions like abstract reasoning, working memory, and symbolic representation alongside adaptive behavior.
Which changes how society treats them.
It cleanly separates the clinical syndrome from the societal disability, which has massive positive implications for educational policy, support services, and disability rights.
We have covered an immense amount of clinical territory. We explored the differing philosophies of the two maps, the DSM and the ICD. We've seen how prototype matching works, and we've analyzed the massive shifts in schizophrenia, mood, trauma, and personality. But we have to face the clinical reality. These maps often clash in the real world. How do we integrate these systems, especially considering that the vast majority of mental health care never even reaches a specialist psychiatrist's office?
That is the ultimate reality check. The WHO explicitly acknowledges that the bulk of global psychiatric morbidity is managed by primary care physicians, not specialists. To address this, they concurrently developed the ICD-11-PHC, a version specifically tailored for primary healthcare settings. And the working groups behind this propose some highly pragmatic, almost radical simplifications of the psychiatric taxonomy.
The text mentions the dysphoric disorders proposal, which ties back to our earlier discussion on mixed anxiety and depression.
Exactly. The PHC working group proposed practically abandoning the strict specialist distinction between anxiety disorders and mood disorders in the primary care setting, suggesting instead a meta-category of dysphoric disorders. This acknowledges a fundamental truth. At the level of the general practitioner, the immediate clinical imperative is often identifying severe distress and initiating broad, evidence-based interventions like SSRIs or basic psychological support.
They don't have time for the minutia.
Right. It is not necessarily to tease apart the nuanced minutia of whether a patient has 60% depressive symptoms and 40% anxiety symptoms. They also propose a category for bodily distress disorders, which would combine unexplained somatic complaints and health preoccupations, creating a much simpler, wider diagnostic net for GPs who are constantly faced with patients whose psychological distress manifests primarily as physical pain.
But what about the specialists? The researchers? There is an ongoing, rather fraught debate in the academic literature about harmonization. The utopian idea that the ICD and the DSM should eventually merge, or at least perfectly mirror each other. But the textbook poses the painful, unanswerable question. Which direction should it go? If they differ, who is right?
That question plunges us into a geopolitical and scientific minefield. If the ICD's culturally integrated criteria for anxiety disorders demonstrate superior clinical utility globally, should the American DSM be forced to adopt them? Or if the DSM's highly operationalized symptom checklists are undeniably superior for ensuring the validity of multi-million-dollar pharmaceutical trials, should the WHO adopt those?
It's a huge conflict.
It's not merely a debate over scientific logic. It is heavily entangled with national pride, professional territoriality, and immense financial implications for health insurance billing systems worldwide.
The textbook highlights the work of Michael First, a prominent psychiatrist heavily involved in these classification debates, who outlines 3 potential strategies for the future.
Yes. First, lays out the options clearly. Strategy 1. Select one of the 2 systems as the absolute foundational base and mandate that the other system adopts it. Politically and practically, this is a non-starter. Strategy 2. Attempt to merge the best elements of both to create a single, new, unified, global system. A noble utopian goal, but achieving international consensus on what empirically constitutes the best criteria is practically impossible.
So is the third.
Strategy 3, which First champions as the most pragmatic, proceed disorder by disorder. For schizophrenia, the committees would look at the empirical evidence and mutually agree to adopt either the DSM or the ICD definition, based strictly on which has proven superior validity and clinical utility in recent trials.
It sounds like an exhausting, decades-long administrative battle, but it perfectly highlights the sociologic controversies that surround psychiatric classification. The text ends with a profound warning to clinicians about the reification effect. How should we conceptualize reification as we close out this deep dive?
Reification is the most dangerous cognitive trap a psychiatrist can fall into. It occurs when we create a diagnostic concept like major depressive disorder or schizophrenia, which, as we've established, are just man-made constructs, tools designed to cluster symptoms so we can communicate.
But we forget there are tools.
Exactly. Over time, we begin to treat that construct as if it is a concrete, physical entity existing independently in nature, like a virus or a lung tumor. When we reify our diagnoses, we forget they are merely tools. We risk ignoring the unique, unimaginably complex reality of the human being sitting in front of us. We start treating the label rather than treating the patient. Furthermore, we must actively remain aware of how these labels carry immense weight. They impact legal proceedings, pharmaceutical development, and personal stigma. As the old adage goes, the map is not the territory.
The map is not the territory. That brings us perfectly full circle to our opening metaphor of the map makers. So what are the core actionable takeaways from this deep dive into Chapter 9.2? First, the ICD-11 represents a monumental, deliberate shift toward global clinical utility over pure research reliability. It embraces dimensional thinking through the innovative use of qualifiers, and it formally embeds cultural context directly into the diagnostic process through narrative prototype matching.
Spot on.
Second, it starkly and intentionally diverges from the DSM-5 in several critical arenas. It vehemently retains the bereavement exclusion to protect normal human grief from being pathologized.
Yeah.
It embraces the clinical reality of mixed anxiety and depression, and it has executed a complete radical overhaul of personality disorders by abolishing categorical types in favor of a dimensional severity scale and trait domains.
A massive change.
And finally, the overarching lesson of the text is that psychiatric assessment is fundamentally a process of pattern recognition. Classification systems are evolving tools tailored to help the patient navigate their distress. They are not infallible truths, and they are certainly not just mechanisms to satisfy a billing code. And I want to leave you, the listener, with a final, slightly provocative thought to mull over as you head into your next clinic. If we fundamentally agree that diagnostic classifications are not true or false, but merely useful or not useful, what happens in the next 10 or 20 years when artificial intelligence can seamlessly recognize complex, multidimensional symptomatic patterns across millions of patients? Patterns that are far too subtle or complex for the human brain to categorize. Will we still need these vast encyclopedic books of human-made classification at all? Or will the map finally become the territory?
A fascinating and perhaps slightly terrifying question. Now, before we wrap up, let's stress test what we've covered today with a brief clinical reasoning review based on the core concepts of the text. I'll pose a few scenarios or conceptual questions, and I encourage you to formulate your answer before we discuss the solution. Ready?
Ready.
If a junior trainee asks you what the fundamental guiding principle was during the massive 11th revision of the ICD, how would you articulate it? Was it about ensuring perfect alignment with the American DSM, or establishing stricter operational symptom counts, or something else?
Based on everything we've discussed, the core driving force was absolutely achieving global clinical utility, backed by research evidence, ensuring the map actually worked for clinicians from London to rural clinics globally.
Precisely correct. Let's move to the most radical shift we discussed. If you are evaluating a patient with profound chronic interpersonal difficulties and a history of self-harm, how does the ICD-11 fundamentally evaluate their presentation compared to the old ICD-10 or DSM-5? Are we looking for the right cluster to put them in?
Not anymore. We are abandoning the type-specific categories entirely. The clinician must now use a single-dimensional scale of severity rating at mild, moderate, or severe, and then pair that severity rating with specific trait domain qualifiers like disinhibition or negative affectivity.
Excellent. Now, consider a patient presenting with classic symptoms of a major depressive episode: insomnia, profound sadness, loss of appetite, but their spouse died unexpectedly 3 weeks ago. What is the key distinction between how the DSM-5 and the ICD-11 handle this presentation regarding exclusion criteria?
This is the philosophical divide over grief. The DSM-5 removed the bereavement exclusion, potentially allowing for a diagnosis of depression. But the ICD-11 vehemently retains bereavement as an exclusion criterion to avoid pathologizing a normal, biologically evolved human process.
Spot on. Let's look at primary psychotic disorders. When diagnosing schizophrenia in the ICD-11, how has the approach to subtyping and symptom emphasis evolved? Are we still relying on Kurt Schneider's first-rank symptoms as pathognomonic?
No, the first-rank symptoms have been de-emphasized as they lack the specificity we once thought they had. More importantly, traditional subtypes like paranoid or catatonic schizophrenia have been completely dropped because they lack longitudinal stability. Instead, the diagnosis now utilizes a system of qualifiers to dynamically describe current symptoms, course, and cognitive function.
Precisely. Next, imagine you are a primary care physician seeing a patient who presents with an equal mix of chronic worry, muscle tension, profound sadness, and anhedonia, but doesn't quite meet the full symptom count or duration for either major depressive disorder or generalized anxiety disorder. How does the ICD-11 handle this compared to the DSM?
Because the ICD-11 prioritizes a bottom-up clinical utility approach, it retains a specific category of mixed anxiety and depressive disorder, giving that GP a valid diagnostic framework to initiate treatment rather than forcing the patient into an unspecified category.
Perfect. And finally, reflecting on the actual mechanism of using the manual. How does the ICD-11 approach its diagnostic guidelines compared to the DSM's heavy reliance on operational criteria and strict symptom checklists?
The ICD-11 relies on the cognitive process of prototype matching. The clinician reads a rich, narrative clinical description of the disorder and uses their expert judgment to rate how well the patient matches that prototype rather than just tallying up a rigid symptom count.
Outstanding synthesis. We strongly encourage you to return to Chapter 9.2 in Kaplan and Sadok to review these concepts, mechanisms, and nuances in their full clinical context.
Here are the details of this episode.
Clinical manifestations of psychiatric disorders. Byline. Psychiatric disorders are not diseases that can be seen directly. They reveal themselves through patterns of thought, emotion, behavior, perception, and human experience. Episode description. Imagine Medlock Holmes entering a vast hall of mirrors. Each mirror reflects a different aspect of human experience. Mood, thought, perception, memory, behavior, identity, motivation, and consciousness. Most reflections remain coherent and integrated, yet in some mirrors, subtle distortions begin to appear. A thought becomes fixed, an emotion becomes overwhelming, a perception no longer matches reality, a behavior loses its adaptive purpose. Each mirror reflects a different aspect of human experience. Holmes quickly realizes that psychiatric disorders rarely announce themselves through laboratory tests or imaging findings. Instead, they reveal themselves through clinical manifestations, the observable and reported experiences that provide clues to underlying psychological and neurobiological processes. Each mirror reflects a different aspect of human experience. This chapter serves as a guide to the language of psychopathology. It explores how psychiatric disorders present across multiple domains of mental functioning, including disturbances of mood, anxiety, cognition, perception, thought processes, thought content, behavior, and consciousness. Each mirror reflects a different aspect of human experience. A central theme is that symptoms rarely occur in isolation. Depression may present not simply as sadness, but as altered sleep, diminished concentration, loss of motivation, guilt, hopelessness, and psychomotor change. Psychosis may involve hallucinations, delusions, disorganized thinking, emotional disturbance, and behavioral abnormalities. Anxiety may manifest cognitively, emotionally, physiologically, and behaviorally. Each mirror reflects a different aspect of human experience. The chapter introduces the clinician's task of transforming observations into meaningful patterns. Individual symptoms become syndromes, syndromes become diagnoses, diagnoses become frameworks for understanding and treatment. Each mirror reflects a different aspect of human experience. Particular attention is given to the distinction between symptoms and signs. Symptoms are the subjective experiences described by patients, while signs are the objective observations made by clinicians. Both are essential components of psychiatric assessment. Each mirror reflects a different aspect of human experience. The chapter also explores the importance of context. Similar manifestations may arise from very different causes. Agitation may reflect mania, psychosis, anxiety, substance use, delirium, personality factors, or medical illness. Understanding psychiatric symptoms therefore requires both careful observation and thoughtful interpretation. Each mirror reflects a different aspect of human experience. Ultimately, this chapter teaches that psychiatric assessment is a process of pattern recognition. The clinician becomes an investigator of human experience, learning to recognize how disorders reveal themselves through the language of the mind. Each mirror reflects a different aspect of human experience. Each mirror reflects a different aspect of human experience. Key takeaways. Each mirror reflects a different aspect of human experience. Psychiatric disorders are identified through clinical manifestations rather than direct biological observation. Each mirror reflects a different aspect of human experience. Symptoms are subjective experience.